Having clear goals, ideally purpose-led goals or purposeful goals, is really important. Not setting off too far on the journey without knowing really, frankly, where you're heading.
Welcome to Radical Transformation, the show where we bring you up close and personal with the experts transforming business today. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Alastair Horn. Alastair's a seasoned transformation director, program director, and executive coach. And he's worked in large organizations, small organizations, with a common thread throughout of helping cut through complexity to build capacity, capability, and confidence in change. Welcome to the show, Alastair. How are you today?
I'm very well, Mike. Thank you for inviting me along.
A pleasure. Delighted to have you on the show. And one thing that struck me in our conversations recently was that you liken your job within organizations to befriending an octopus. How so?
Befriending an octopus. Well, maybe it's a slightly quirky analogy, but I mean, just as an octopus has, as we all know, multiple legs, each arm or leg of an octopus actually has a mind of its own. There's then a head and actually quite a big heart. And that's quite similar in many ways to organizations and firms. They often have limbs, aspects, divisions, organizations that are sort of having a mind of their own. And often when it comes to radical transformation, part of the challenge is to get things working in sync, is to get things moving in the right direction, and to get things working harmoniously. So there's a reason why I think actually befriending an octopus has some analogies with what I love to do.
I get it, and I like it, Alastair. So tell our listeners a bit more about what you do and how you actually got into this line of work in the first place.
Yeah, well, there are two things that I do. One is driving large-scale transformation, complex end-to-end change within organizations, typically financial services, but others as well. And the second string to my bow is executive coaching and team facilitation. And I think part of what I want to touch on today as part of radical transformation is how sort of the coaching mindset, if you will, has really lots to inform the way I think you should drive transformation. And I think it's almost the secret sauce to successful radical transformation.
Got it. So, Alastair, you've got an interesting backstory. Tell us a little bit more about this secret sauce that you mentioned there.
Yeah, and my background is rather wide and varied. I started out in academia, actually, and was sponsored to do research into computer science, backed by a venture capital firm at the time, which was really exciting. It didn't ultimately prove successful, but you learn from your failures as much as you learn from your successes. I moved then to work for a large computer company that many people will have heard of, Sun Microsystems, now Oracle. That was about $1 billion of revenue when I joined, and it grew to $18 billion. So you can imagine the wild ride that was. And I started out in technical consulting roles, but rapidly moved more into business and business change roles, delivering projects and programs and working in professional services and traveling the world with that organization as well. And latterly delivering finance and organizational and administrative change on a very large scale. But I got a little bit tired of flying to California too often. The passport was rammed with the stamps you get when you go to the States. And then I moved out of that into actually private equity and joined a firm that had just been purchased by 3 private equity firms, driving transformation on their behalf in a customer management outsourcing space. So you can see all through that career to that point, learning about change, about transformation, and bringing different experiences. And also having that sense that there was something more to it than the traditional way of driving projects and programs. And then for the last dozen years or so, I've worked in various companies, the common thread being driving change and transformation, and more recently, developed a line in coaching. So as I said, that secret sauce, I think, which I've come to recognize is that interplay and the things I've learned over the years and then the things I've seen work and don't work and the interplay between the two. Okay.
So a lot of experience there. Let's try and unpick that. Can you give some examples to illustrate some of that richness and diversity of experience you've had in industry over a long period of time now?
Yeah. Well, let's just talk a little bit about perhaps one of those examples and how this coaching mindset applies. And before I do, maybe just talk about what is that coaching mindset. What it is really is about, for me, it's about supporting and developing people to successfully navigate change, rather than the traditional approach, which is overly directing people. That command and control and managing to a plan is quite different than a coaching approach, which is about fostering that environment of learning, of growth, and of solution-focused thinking. So let me give an example of that. I spent 3 years at HomeServe. Now, many people may know HomeServe. They provide boiler cover, electric cover, home maintenance. And actually last year, they were the largest UK sale from being a listed company to being purchased by a private equity firm. A few years ago, they had the challenge that they were regulated by the FSA at the time, the Financial Conduct Authority now, of a number of challenges in selling practices historically. And so effectively the firm had to stop selling, turn the tap off. And I was brought in and worked under 3 different chief execs to really get a grip of that and drive a transformational program to be able to switch the business back on again and actually move to what they have done, strength to strength, and back to being the best they could be. And I think the example there is at face value. And if you'd looked on the wall of my office at the time, there were 23 work streams. You know, your classic multi-pronged transformation, everything from product design to sales and marketing to the digital storefront to customer services to actually, of course, a remediation and redress process for customers who've been disadvantaged historically. But much more than that, it was about listening to folks at the sharp end, the agents in the contact center, the partners who acted as intermediaries, the customers who were picking up the phone, and really turning it on its head. And actually, the coaching mindset says that the answers often come from the folks at the traditional bottom of the pyramid, but by inverting that and having an environment where people can speak up, they can bring ideas, and as long as it's in the general direction of travel, actually 1,000 changes across the firm actually, I think, made much more impact than successful execution of those 20 odd projects and programs. So yes, there's a place for your classic direction of having a portfolio of programs, but for real radical transformation, it's about harnessing the power of the entire organization. And HomeServe was a really good example of that, I think.
It's a great example, Alice. And I remember at the time, going back a few years, we were doing some work with that business, and it was a difficult, challenging time for them, wasn't it? I remember visits to Warsaw and a real sort of feeling of we're in this together, but turn around. And it's really then that clear leadership is required. And by the sounds of it, that radical transformation was also a sum of a lot of incremental change within the business as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Successive chief execs began to take more of that approach of really empowering their staff and colleagues within the firm. And as someone coming in to drive transformation, it's much more than the sum of the initiatives. It really is. Radical transformation, which is the theme of these podcasts, really does benefit from engaging all of the folks who are part of an organization and their partners and the ecosystem. And that's where the coaching mindset, which, as I say, I think informs my transformation practice now, really helps. The listening, the empathetic engagement, and something we'll perhaps come on to is the importance of giving questions as much as giving answers.
Let's come back to that, Alastair, because I think that's a really interesting topic. I want to ask you for your advice and guidance to the listener who's faced with a scenario where they're not so much transforming an enterprise, but starting from scratch. perhaps with a blank sheet of paper, maybe building a brand new business from the ground up, either as part of an established business or perhaps where there's nothing at all. So what advice and guidance would you give to that listener who isn't so much transforming enterprise, but starting from ground zero?
Yeah, I think that is quite different, as you say. Large transformation can mean change in a large organization, but it's no more radical if it's a small organization or mid-size going through massive change, particularly launching a business. I spent 3 years working with Flood Re, a reinsurer in the city that was established under government legislation, but with the funding and support of the insurance industry, and is now a successful business. At the time, it was a small band, it felt, of pioneers, and importantly, with a number of key partners for the administration and the technology and the digital storefront. And one of the lessons there was that no amount of project planning, in the traditional sense of everything being defined to the nth degree, really works when it comes to radical transformation. It really is more about setting the goal, and that's critically important. It's more about asking the right questions, and it's about having an open environment where you can assess and adjust as you go. And many firms, of course, now have adopted the more agile methodologies of change. But I think everybody has to find their own blend of what works. But for me, in that small startup, and for others in that startup, having a clear goal, putting the plan almost to one side, and having an open environment where you can engage and listen and assess and adjust is really important. And I'll maybe just give an example of where we had to make an intervention in that business, if that's of interest.
Yeah, let's have that, actually, because I'm also curious. I'm dying to ask you how you would overcome the challenge of also having some businesses that ordinarily would be competitors, the fierce competitors in the same room, in this case, working together to establish this government levy scheme, which is in the best interests of the consumer for those that wouldn't otherwise be able to receive flood cover, as I understand it. But that must have also been a very challenging experience. Can you share with the listener more about how you also were able to work through those the situations, those sometimes difficult conversations?
Absolutely. I mean, the mission, the goal, if you like, was to provide people with affordable and available flood insurance for their homes, something that the market had been singularly unable to provide. But you're right, we had an advisory body. It was called a body, not a board, because it was important that we had a separate board and executive separate to the insurers who were contributing the funds. But you can imagine the conflicting priorities and conflicting points of view of, the top insurers in the UK. Importantly, agreeing on the goal, which I've just alluded to, and how to measure that goal is critically important. And the same is true, actually, when it comes to executive coaching or personal coaching. The initial phase, the most important phase, is to agree, what are we trying to change? What are we trying to achieve? How will we know when we've got there? And, I think a lot of the challenges in launching a business or scaling a business come from being super clear on what success looks like. But, one of the challenges in launching Flood Re, and which had a lot of attention from the executive team, the board, and the advisory body, was that the partners we were working with were really struggling to work at the pace that we needed. And there were bumps along the way because we were doing things for the first time together. Now, in your traditional setup in projects and programs, you have a contract, of course, which we did have, with each of the outsourcing partners. And there's, in many firms, a tradition of managing to contract, supplier management, and using the remedies within the contract to intervene should there be issues of pace or quality. But, when you're working to timescales that can't shift and with oversight that won't let up, it's much better to have that coaching mindset of where you provide an environment where people can speak up about what's working, can highlight what's not working and actually take a solutions focused view to fix it rather than revert back to contract. So one of the things we did as a result of that was I spent an inordinate amount of time just talking to people in the partners, in their suppliers, in our stakeholders and inside the business with really important questions. And questioning is a critical skill, I think, for transformation. Questions like, how is it going? Have you seen this before? What have you seen before that's worked and not worked? What do you believe needs to change? And by asking the right questions and providing an environment where people can feel they can speak up, actually, we managed to deliver on time, on budget, and on quality by almost putting the contract to one side and actually doing the right thing. And I think that's a real lesson for radical transformation.
That's a great story, Alastair. It must have been quite a pivotal moment in your career, leading the Flood Re build.
Yeah, the difference with Flood Re, and I think it's something I look for in engagements, is that sense of purpose. And I know there is a lot in terms of management thinking at the moment about purpose-led organizations. But, you know, back to goals and the importance of goals in radical transformation. If those goals are purpose-led and you can win the hearts and minds, people will almost literally walk over hot coals for you because that purpose is really compelling. And so I look back on engagements like Flood Re with a sense of quiet pride that we did the right thing. And I think that's really important to me. And I think a lot of people who work in transformation, it's about delivering purposeful change.
Brilliant. Also, I want to come back to something you've mentioned a few times now, that coaching mindset. So looking at some more of your experience, what other examples of the coaching mindset within transformation might be of interest to our listeners? And, you know, what can you share to enlighten them on how that has really become critical to success in any program?
Yeah, I think it's increasingly important. And for example, many firms now have adopted the agile approach of change and of variations on a theme, be it scaled agile or some other alternative version of the same. You hear about product operating models and similar. There's a philosophy there of turning the pyramid upside down, of setting clear goals. But the role of the leadership team and the role of transformation leadership is to remove the barriers, is to almost get out of the way of the folks who are really driving the change on the ground. The other is the notion that none of us have a perfect view of the future and the importance of assessing and adjusting. So let me give maybe the example of, I spent 2 or 3 years at the Coventry Building Society, the second largest society in the UK. Now, when I arrived, charged with driving at that time quite a complex transformational change based on technology, and latterly took over the whole change portfolio, there was a syndrome which the chief operating officer at the time referred to as eyes bigger than tummies, which really resonated with me. And I asked him what he meant by eyes bigger than tummies. And he said, well, we set a budget every year for change, for transformation, if you like, as well as the day-to-day. And each year, the change team come back at the end of the year to say we spent less, which you might think is great. But the bad news was we've spent less, but we've delivered even less still. So the challenge was one of capacity, of capability, and ultimately competence to be able to deliver that change. So putting a sort of coaching mindset on that transformational challenge, you start with the goal, you ensure that you are actively listening and that you're asking the right questions, much more than just putting in place plans of work. And at the Coventry, we moved to instead of having a a yearly review cycle, or even worse, a 5-year plan, we moved to having a quarterly cadence whereby you set, yes, the objectives for the year or for even for the longer period, but the key results and the programs and initiatives that are driving the transformation towards delivering those are reviewed on a quarterly cadence. And the benefit of that is you're tapping into the ideas, the opportunities, and you're being much more responsive and reactive. And at the same time, you can build capability and capacity much more easily in that sort of a cadence. So I think that's a big lesson for me. The transformation at the Coventry, which continues and has done in the few years since I've left, they've moved now very much to adopt that quarterly program implement process, which is really paying dividends for them.
That's interesting, because in the past, I think, we've seen a lot of 1, 3, even 5-year plans. Does that mean that is there a real shift there, in your opinion, in a world that is changing so much more quickly now? Is it even prudent to sort of still have a 5-year plan, or should businesses be looking at quarterly planning and much more agile thinking here?
I think it's a really good question. At Bank of Ireland, UK, where I was working recently, there was a really interesting goal and challenge at the Bank of Ireland, which was to move to what the chief exec referred to as a multi-niche bank, a more bespoke, a more profitable, a smaller bank, but one which would be fit for the future. And interestingly there, the coaching mindset I saw in spades, in that the executive team really had that philosophy of listening, engaging, empathizing, having a clear goal and direction. But although there was a portfolio of change, actually the success of Bank of Ireland and the last results were phenomenal for the UK, has been through that sort of myriad changes and the real engagement of folks in that journey. But I remember, just to your question, as I'm segueing a little, we had a partner there who was struggling a little in part of the operation. And part of the challenge is asking the right questions. We'll maybe come back to that. And one of the questions I asked is, are you on track? How do you know you're on track? And how can we help? And the answer that came back was, well, we have a 5,000-line Microsoft project plan. Now, straight away, that set off alarm bells, because I think that's answering a different question. And actually, that proved correct. The answer to the problem, and there was a problem, was not a plan, but it was re-engaging, rethinking, and re-energizing that part of the program. So the coaching mindset really helped us at Bank of Ireland. And part of what I've touched on there is the importance of asking the right questions.
That's brilliant. And just picking up on that challenge, sometimes when a program goes off track, trying to bring it back onto track is often also about re-engaging with the stakeholders at all levels and winning hearts and minds, so that people are going to really go again when they may have change and transformation fatigue. Can you give me some examples of how you have worked with organizations to really re-engage and win those hearts and minds back, to get people back on the team?
There's an example more recently, actually. Part of my coaching practice, I'm working with a startup firm that has been operating for half a dozen years or so now. And I've got some amazing products that they haven't yet brought to market. But actually, as we explored their personal goals for transforming that company into a high growth scaling tech firm, which it will shortly become, that challenge of the problems of being stuck in a cycle almost. And part of coaching with individuals, and the same is true of a coaching mindset with firms and organizations, is to recognize when you're repeating those patterns of behavior. And it plays to the question you had of when programs are drifting or seemingly going backwards. There are patterns of behavior typically that if you uncover those with the right questions, people actually, there's a principle in coaching of unconditional positive regard. Now, when I first heard that phrase, unconditional positive regard, it really took me back, because it starts from the premise that people want to do the right thing, that people do have the answers generally, but what gets in the way sometimes is confusion or difficult relationships or a lack of clarity about what people are trying to do. So I think there are some lessons there about just asking the right questions, and people will generally find the answers.
Alastair, I know you're very passionate about your coaching, and you've been taking some time out to really invest in yourself, and it's something that you're seeing some great results in. Again, what sort of advice would you give to any of our listeners that are considering investing in their own personal development in coaching? What can you share? What suggestions might you make as to how they might do that? Because I think it's more than reading a book, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I first had a coach myself back in my days at Fleury. The chief exec at Fleury was quite forward thinking and had asked a coach of his to coach all of the executive team. And I can remember my first meeting with the coach and thinking, am I in trouble? Is there something I haven't done? Is the coach here to give me advice and set me straight? But, you know, it's the exact opposite, and was the exact opposite. A coach is there to help you think through what you or the organization wants to achieve, where you are today, what some of the barriers or constraints might be, some of them in your head as much as in reality, and think through ways and means of getting to the end result and taking some positive action. So that really helped me. There was so much stress and pressure, as you can imagine, in trying to launch a business under tight timescales. That coaching really helped. And then more recently, as you say, I've taken some time out to become accredited with the International Coaching Federation, and have been trained by a company called Barefoot Coaching. And that is a 6-month program. You know, I thought I knew a little bit about coaching and pick things up, as you say, from books. But when I look back at my career, I've used some of those tools and techniques to great effect, I think, in transformation. But I'm really convinced now more than anything that the interplay and having a coaching mindset for radical transformation, I think it is that secret sauce that can really help.
Great. And so a couple of questions before we wrap up. I'm dying to ask you, what trends are you seeing today in the transformation industry, and what predictions would you make for its future?
Well, transformation never goes away. Sometimes it goes in waves, of course, but every firm, there's something that I read a few days ago that really resonated with me, was that the biggest single waste of time is comparing yourself to other people. And I thought for a minute, is that true? Single biggest waste of time is comparing yourself to other people. And I think the takeaway from that is, for radical transformation, it's not about me too. It's not about being incrementally better than the next person. It's about genuinely thinking, what's the purpose of this organization, this firm, this group of people? How can we move forward radically in serving our stakeholders better? It also reminds me of something I heard 20 years ago at a tech conference in the States. And we were talking about what it meant to have a tagline, a purpose, a goal. And someone stood up and talked about their firm and said, tongue in cheek, that their goal was to be no worse than anybody else. Now, we could laugh about that, but I think transformation for me, radical transformation, is about that leapfrogging. The other trend I see is the coaching mindset, and having the right questions asked is something that the executive team are increasingly mindful of. And we're seeing now chief transformation officers sit on excos much more often than we did before. We're also seeing transformation directors like myself who may even be coming as an interim, nevertheless invited into the executive committee to ask those questions and to help rally the coaching mindset amongst the executive team. And it is, for some executives, I think, slightly counterintuitive, but actually I think when grasped, it really does make a difference. The other little trend I'm seeing is, and it's early days, and we'll see, is a more of a fractional approach, by which I mean people having access to a resource for a duration, either on a call-off basis or on a regular basis. We already have fractional CFOs, and I think fractional transformation officers, where they're acting as a catalyst to help an internal organization and their partners really get the best from transformation, is something that I'm seeing, particularly in the early stages. The very worst time, I think, to bring in a transformation director or transformation lead is after the train has already left the station. The better time really is when you're planning the journey, loading the coal up in the tender and stoking the fire, rather than expecting someone to come and stop a runaway train, which is often the case.
Yeah, you're usually, in my experience, in turnaround mode then, and that's
and there's an excitement, and there's a sort of a kudos in fixing something that's not as it should be, but much better for firms who are planning transformation to engage early. And I was speaking with a building society CIO a few weeks ago who were planning a radical, and I do mean radical transformation, effectively rebuilding the society with a brand new platform and a brand new operation to the side. And we had an hour's conversation, and the nub of that was, have they asked the right questions? Not in the traditional mode where firms may engage with consulting firms who are expected to give the answers. I think much more valuable, or as valuable, is to know the right questions. And I think we agreed in that conversation that the 4 or 5 questions that were key to them, fortunately, were 4 or 5 questions that they were mindful of. And that was really heartening to hear.
Brilliant. And my last question, Alastair, is this. What parting advice would you give to the listener being asked to step up right now and radically transform their organisation? What thoughts would you like to leave these listeners with?
Earlier about part of, I think, the role of transformation lead, coach, hybrid is not to have the answers, but to know the questions. But I will try and answer your question. Having clear goals, ideally purpose-led goals or purposeful goals, is really important. Not setting off too far on the journey without knowing really, frankly, where you're heading. The second is the right questions. I think we've spoken about that, and they are really, really, really important. You know, I've been in coaching sessions myself, and my coach will have asked me a question, and it really makes you think. It really makes you think. And that's critically important for organizations as well. I think the third point would be recognize that you can't do transformation to an organization. The organization transforms, and empowering the organization and being less directive and more coaching is actually really super helpful. And then I guess the last point, and it's probably self-evident, is if you haven't got a transformation director or someone with a coaching mindset in the firm, do consider bringing that in. And I think it will make a difference.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alastair. So some great advice there. What's next for you?
Well, I am looking forward to 2 coaching sessions tomorrow. The high growth tech firm that I mentioned had a strategy away days this week. And I'm eager to hear what they've concluded. But again, what's really important is that I ask the right questions when I speak to them tomorrow. And I'm really looking forward to that.
Fantastic. Alastair, I've loved having you on the show.
Thank you.
keep in touch. And thanks for sharing this advice and the benefit of all your experience with our listeners. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike. It's been absolutely marvelous. Thank you.
You're welcome.